Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Newsroom. I'm your host Omar Khalid, but today is the 25th of April 2024 and these are the stories that we will be highlighting during the course of the show. We'll begin, ladies and gentlemen, with the role of digital growth in economic stability in Pakistan and of course the relationship that digital growth and access also have. Now, according to a new UNDP report in Pakistan titled Doing Digital for Development, Access, Adopt, Anticipate, Accelerate, noticeable differences of human development can be seen between different districts in Pakistan. And of course, that is something that the minister, our minister Hassan Iqbal Sahab has said that the government is going to work upon. And it also talks about equitable and safe access to technology as an important means of improving human lives. And of course, different aspects of it need to be understood and implemented by countries such as Pakistan as well. At the same time, we are also going to discuss digital trade, how important it is, and with the European Union and other countries that are implementing different modalities as far as digital trade is concerned, how to move forward in order to stabilize Pakistan in the realm of digital economy. This is going to be our first segment. Our second story, ladies and gentlemen, concerns information disorders, fake news, deep fake news, and of course so many other things that concern the issues that information has on social media and how to tackle them in one way or the other in the educational institutions, in the normal society. And of course, we will also refer to a report that came out in January this year where risk specialists have predicted that extreme weather and misinformation were likely to trigger a global crisis in the next couple of years. This was a report entitled Global Risks Report 2024 by the World Economic Forum. We're going to discuss different aspects of it in our second segment. Then we are going to talk about World Malaria Day that is being observed across the world, including in Pakistan today. Our Prime Minister also issued a special message on the occasion talking about the theme of this day, that is advancing health equity, gender equality and human rights, which is an undertaking to involve multiple stakeholders like policymakers, like donors, like healthcare providers and community members from all walks of life to fight against malaria. Finally, we're going to talk about Venice, that has become the first city to charge tourists in the coming months, because as you know, the peak season for the tourists is about to begin, and Venice now becomes the first city in the world to introduce a payment system to thin the crowds that throng the canals during the peak holiday season. Will it work? Will it not work? Well, only time will tell. Let's begin with our first story, and that concerns the role of digital growth in economic stability. How important is digital growth and digital access for countries such as Pakistan in order to strengthen itself, stabilize itself in the realm of economy and more. We've been joined to talk about this very important issue by two guests, one in the studios, one online. In the studios, we've got Asad Baig, Director MMFD. Thank you very much, Asad, to have joined us in the studio. Online, sorry, we've got Nazir. He's an Associate Research Fellow with the SDPI. I will begin with you, Asad. Now, over half of the country's population does not have access to internet, as per a report that the UNDP has recently released, and that was also inaugurated by Hassan Iqbal Sahab, who is our very important minister. The report is called Doing Digital for Development, Access, Adopt, Anticipate, Accelerate, and it looks at noticeable differences in different communities across Pakistan. Looking at that, how important do you feel is digital transformation for any nation, and do you feel its link is extremely important as far as human development is concerned, and do you also feel that this digital transformation should be across the board?
It should be across the board, and I think you said something about developing countries and how nations develop. I think at this point in time, in this century, there is no other way for any country or nation to develop but in terms of digital development. So that it goes without saying. Number two, you talked about access. I think one of the biggest primers for digital development in any country is access, which means access to technology, access to internet, and access to other services, including e-governance for that matter, equitably and equally to all citizens. Now, it's easier said than done, obviously. In Pakistan, what we call this digital gap, essentially, has been massive, and I think during COVID, it was painfully obvious how massive this gap was. And during COVID, we did a lot of research studies and we found out that the children or the students who had access to internet, who were studying from home, or youngsters, people who were working from home, they were doing better as opposed to people who didn't have access to internet. And then we obviously within those research frameworks, we found out that the people who didn't have access to internet, they were already from the lower socio-economic backgrounds, areas which are already underdeveloped, people who are already from the low-income backgrounds, and generally they're not very well-to-do areas. So in that way, this access, the lack of access, further exacerbated their poverties and so on and so forth. So this is a prime example of how digital divide can be the deciding factor when it comes to digital development. Now in Pakistan, there has been, unfortunately, I would say, a lot of focus on other things, but not on access. We feel that there needs to be a lot more access in Pakistan, focus on Pakistan in terms of access, and I'm not just talking about providing internet, but meaningful access equitably to all the societies. Now, one more thing, Omar, we found out which was really damaging and distressing for all of us was within the larger communities, the further marginalized communities, they are the ones who are getting affected the most. For instance, we found out women are generally pushed out of this access gamut when it comes to the debate, right? Because they're further marginalized. And then it comes to the religious minorities or gender minorities and other kinds of minorities and so on. So all of this essentially, again, is exacerbated by the lack of access, which I feel is the primer, like I said, for digital development in any country.
And I think there also should be no divide as far as access to wealth or the class system is concerned. I think irrespective of class, we need to have access and proper access to the internet to be able to use it to our best of capabilities and capacities.
Right.
Let's come to our second guest. Ahad, I hope you're online with us. Our planning minister Ehsan Iqbal says the government is committed to harnessing the benefits of technological innovation to improve livelihood prospects, accelerate financial inclusion, improve employment, and deliver efficient public services. This requires establishing and enforcing clear rules to prevent anti-competitive behavior by major digital platforms and service providers. Do you feel, Ahad, that sound digital development policies alone can greatly strengthen its present dismal standing in these areas? And what, in your point of view, should be the modalities of such policies?
I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
So Umar Saab, I'll just like to start off by saying that I think we need to highlight the major issues at macroeconomic level that we are facing. We have low exports, we have to create a lot of jobs, and we have to lure in investment. And I think this digital sector automatically becomes the best possible way for it to happen. So just to give you an example, the trade balance, which is the main issue for us, the trade imbalance, I think will be more appropriate. So 70% to 80% positive trade balance is caused by the digital sector. So I think it is very important for countries like Pakistan to focus on the digital sector, especially in the case of exports. And what you alluded to, of course, there are policies available. One of the aspect is the full implementation of the policy, and from a governance point of view, another aspect is that if we divide the digital sector operationally into two aspects, one is the telecom or the infrastructural part, and the other one is the actual implementation or the IT part, then IT is devolved into the provinces and the telecom sector is majorly in the central domain. So this type of coordination issues, I think these are the most important to resolve, and then of course we can go forward and look at the benefits coming in. Like for example, the data protection bill was approved by the cabinet, I think somewhere around 2021, but it is still not passed by the parliament because they have to sort of create a buy-in from the provinces as well, which of course was not the case at the moment. But these I think should be the priority areas where we need to focus. And similarly, like for example, the emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, we all have started using it, but just like the EU has now started formulating their AI legislation, and one legislation is already out, but they are adopting it because the technology is changing at a very rapid pace. So I think we need to also focus on adoptive policy making as well as implementation.
All right, wonderful. Coming back to the studios and of course Asad Baig. Asad, digital trade, I mean, he was talking to the European Union. Now, digital trade is a key element in the EU's trade policy, and every modern trade agreement that the EU has concluded contains a dedicated digital trade chapter. Now, Ahad, alluded to the AI policy that the EU has now also implemented. Should Pakistan, in your point of view, aim also to have a digital trade agreement with the EU, that is the world's largest exporter and importer of digitally deliverable services, and we also, of course, have the GSP Plus with the EU? So maybe that could be a part and parcel of it, or an independent agreement.
I think this could be one of the driving factors of the digital development that we were talking about earlier, and it will be definitely. I think a great move if we move towards that way. Obviously, we still informally have a lot of digital businesses with the European companies and with the EU itself. But formally, generally, I think one of the biggest things that my colleague was talking about is the data privacy and protection. So the EU does business with the GDPR compliant companies because they have this data protection framework within their countries, and all of the service providers should be GDPR compliant. Whereas in Pakistan, as my colleague was saying, there is no data protection law. But further to that, the bill that he was referring to, I'm happy that that bill was not passed because it had serious problems. And this is where I was talking about that we should not jump the gun in terms of legislating for digital policy or making digital policies for development without this process of what we call multi-stakeholderism. Because if we do that, unfortunately, that'll do more harm than good. Secondly, I think the big point that we need to talk about here is that having a legislation on AI or having a policy on AI will literally do little to proliferate the technology within the masses. I think what we need right now is a massively focused digital literacy interventions across the country. And I'm not just talking about information literacy, but beyond that, I'm also talking about digital literacy, wherein we talk about the technologies, we'll talk about the uses of the technologies, the benefits, and so on and so forth. And that needs to be made very this needs to be turned into common knowledge.
True.
And only then we will be able to harness the true potential of some of these technologies. He mentioned AI, and I could not agree more. And I think this is what we spoke about the last time as well in your show. For instance, the education sector. Now, education sector can massively benefit from generative AI. But the point is, for that to happen, we need to change the whole pedagogy of education system that we have here, right? I remember I told you how the teachers were complaining that the students are coming up with all sorts of assignment using chatgpt. Then perhaps the assignments need to be changed in a manner that the usage of AI or implementation of AI within that framework is actually to benefit the students, not just to allow them to copy and paste the text and so on. You know what I'm saying, right?
Of course.
So in that way, I think having a general policy would do little perhaps for the proliferation of technology. A much more concentrated effort in terms of sector to sector engagement will be needed for the proliferation of technology, specifically like AI.
All right. Ahad, it is being proven in many countries that increased adoption of modern technologies like digital payment systems simply because they ease the commerce for both the buyers and in the sellers in myriad different ways helps also improve national productivity. Do you feel our subcontinent is ready for such a process? Will the common hawker or shopkeeper or the person who is cleaning our streets is ready, or the farmer, the small farmer is ready to adopt such policies?
Thank you. I think I'll agree with my colleague with regards to the digital literacy and literacy not only in the depth but also in the breadth. A lot of people think that they might be digital literate, but I think they need to increase or enhance their scope of the digital learning. And just to focus on the question at hand, I think there is huge potential. I think the smartphone coverage or the penetration, as we say, has been remarkable. I think a lot of people from the lower income groups also have access to smartphones. So I think it is opportune that opportune time to sort of focus on how do they use that technology, whether it will be used in a positive manner that can help the overall macroeconomic challenge. So based on this discussion that we are having, Asian Development Bank and SDPI have conducted a diagnostic of the Pakistan digital sector, and I think the report will be out in about 1 month. And based on that SWOT, I think the digital literacy, of course, is coming out to be the biggest weak point or the opportunity where we can definitely go out. But because I think our biggest strength is the youth population that we have, and that is something that we can offer to the global market.
All right. Thank you so very much to have joined us. Ahad Nazir, Associate Research Fellow at the SDPI. Now coming back to you, Asad, some important questions. Earlier this month, the Competition Commission of Pakistan, otherwise known as the CCP, launched a competition assessment of the digital markets and services to make policy recommendations to help the government ensure global regulatory harmonization. This study claims to understand the impact of the digital markets and services on competition, economic growth and employment opportunities. And the CCP also aims to propose a draft bill on digital markets. Other countries have also implemented such procedures. How important is this measure to strengthen digital markets in Pakistan?
Look, this is, I think, perhaps one thing I've been talking about for a while, and I'm also going to take this opportunity to quickly recommend some of the things that probably the government can do in terms of improving access. But before that, the Competition Commission of Pakistan, I think this is extremely important, because the body that in Pakistan can ensure that there are no monopolies in the digital spaces is the Competition Commission. And we've seen the role of competition commissions across the world. For instance, I was citing the example of Australia earlier, where their Competition Commission came up with this decision that the Facebook and other platforms should be charged or taxed for the journalism content that they use. Because they're using a lot of journalism content without paying for it, right? So this has been a global debate, and the Australian Competition Commission was literally the driving force in that, and we saw that they played a very important role, although that didn't really pan out well in the end because of the blockade of the services and so on, but nonetheless a great example. In Pakistan, I feel CCP can play that role because there are clear monopolies when it comes to digital spaces. But then again, the bill that they draft in the end, or the recommendations that they come up with, would be extremely important. So if they are again rooted in that very narrow aspect of monopolies without considering the impact of those policies on the development of Pakistan, on the human rights, and on like a barrage of other things, then I feel that bill probably will be counterproductive. So what they need to do is conduct their exercises and then do another form of multi-stakeholderism engagement with the with the stakeholders, developers, experts, and so on, and perhaps tone their recommendations in a way that they're holistically accepted, as opposed to just narrowly focusing on their own domain. Number one. Number two, access, like I said, is probably the most important part of what we are talking about right now. Here are some of the key recommendations that I would like to make to the government of how they can improve access. Number one, right now we see a major gap between the people who have mobile phones. They're about, I think, 87%, if I remember it correctly, like massive majority of Pakistani population have access to GSM services, which is the mobile phone. And then about 30 to 40%, if I'm not wrong, have access to mobile internet. So this gap between the people who have access to internet and versus the people who have access to the GSM or mobile services needs to be closed. In which way more people need to have access to internet, mobile internet, more people need to have access to smartphones, more people need to have access to other devices and services, and so on and so forth. Now, how would this be possible? Fortunately, the influx of devices coming in from China, that has made possible, because the new mobile devices, as you know, smartphones are much cheaper now, the second, third, fourth generation of the devices and so on. That potential can be leveraged, number one. Number two, the mobile internet services, that the general infrastructure that we have, that needs to be subsidized for the people who can't afford to have internet access. And these can be students, these can be, I mean, clearly we have been putting in money. We have been giving out laptops, for instance, right? Prime Minister programs, and now we are also thinking about giving out iPads. So as opposed to giving out devices, we need to invest that money into longer term infrastructural projects in the country, by making sure that people have internet access and people have devices, and I'm not talking about like hi-fi expensive laptops, but like mobile devices to access those internet connection and internet-based services. That's number 2. And number 3, which I can't emphasize enough, is the digital literacy part. That has to be included in every curriculum we have, from primary to middle and so on. That needs to be included in the university curriculum, and that needs to be included in general sort of public engagement. Because
and for that, teacher training also needs to be done.
Exactly, and because digital literacy is that one thing that will enable civic participation, right? Because we are not only talking about a mobile or person holding a mobile phone or having access to Twitter or TikTok and X number of services. We are talking about their meaningful participation within the larger ambit of governance and so on. That's only possible when they have information literacy and digital literacy, and they know the responsible use of the device that they're holding in their hands.
And I think that's very important. Now, let's talk a little bit about digital trade. Now, I was looking it up, and the term digital trade has no clear definition, yet it is believed to refer to commerce enabled by electronic means in both goods and services. Now, as far as the G7 countries are concerned and the digital trade principles that they have agreed upon, it covers 5 areas: open digital markets, data free flow with trust, safeguards for workers, consumers and businesses, digital trading systems, and fair and inclusive global governance. Are these principles adaptable, enforceable in countries such as Pakistan? How long can it take for Pakistan to implement these after proper legislation?
Look, I don't think they're enforceable. They're adaptable, yes, definitely. And frankly speaking, for most of them, you don't need to have a legislation. You can just start by having like best practices modules and so modules and models within your systems, and you can pretty much do that. Number 1. Number 2, now this is where it gets interesting, because like you said yourself, digital trade, you can't define it because the definition is so broad. You can't really bring it together.
Agreed.
Now here's another form of digital trade. You create content on YouTube, and it's watched by X number of people, let's say in the US or Canada or wherever, and then the person who's creating content in Pakistan is actually getting the money for it. In that way, you're trading content, information, whatever you may call it, right? So like I said, and like you said, the definition is extremely broad. Now what needs to do? What needs to happen? Number 1, like you rightly pointed out, access to open markets. So in this way, markets are not just access, access through direct communications to, let's say, software houses and so on. So, for instance, you keep hearing, and I'm sure that's a great thing happening in Pakistan. The software export is increasing, right? Great, but this is not the only form of digital trade that can happen. In fact, this is a very small part of the digital trade that we are talking about. So then, if in this case, access to open markets will be access to more platforms, will be more proliferation of content platforms within the country. It will be more openness with regards to technology like OTT, for instance, right? With regards to other means of creating content. So it's extremely broad, and I think again, multi-stakeholderism needs to come on into play here. All of those people who are engaged in any form of digital trade need to sit together, and they need to sit with the government specifically to talk about the policy, and more important than policies, the challenges that they have in terms of accessing those markets and so on. Look, like I said, policies would do little without any meaningful engagement with the people who the policies are for. So first step would be to actually listen to the people who are using these markets, right? A massive trade comes in the form of freelance, for instance. And the earlier, you remember I was talking about the data protection bill? So that had to do something with the data storage, which could have impacted the freelancer massively. And this could have been one of the things that we were talking about, that it could do more harm than good. So, all of these things come into play, and the policy, Omar, comes in the very, very end. So you should not start with the policy. You should end with the policy.
All right.
So the first comes all of this
Access.
what I'm talking about. Access, policy engagements, engagement with the stakeholders, consultations and so on, learning and knowing what needs to be done, and then doing it in terms of a policy form. Unfortunately, we have seen that it's the other way around in the country.
But I think it's understandable the way you're talking about taking things forward as far as digital trade. or our digital economy is concerned. I think this is also something that Pakistan and other countries in our subcontinent also need to look towards in order to sustain themselves economically. Now, how important is inclusion when it comes to all of that? We see that our middle class, that forms the biggest crux of our society, also needs to be given the necessary tools, whether it be through training, through access, to so that they are targeted in the right direction. How do you target a middle class that is not digitally literate? Because you talk a lot of about digital literacy, but how do you bring about I can understand in the classrooms, but what about those who are already in the field?
Look, this is inclusion it's a massive debate, right? And I think recently we've seen the example of inclusion when a young chap from Balochistan went on an MMA stage and basically won Pakistani models, and now everybody is talking about how Pakistan is ahead in MMA and so on. So in that way, there is a lot of talent in Pakistan. The other, I think, example that I'm going to quote is this example of poverty alleviation that we are talking about. And we think that it's a rocket science. In some ways, obviously, it's very difficult in a country like Pakistan because we are very complex. But then again, if you see China, or if you see Thailand, or if you see Vietnam for that matter, one of the biggest things that you would see is inclusion in the workforces. How? Women. Because they're based on this idea of a very 50-50 workforce. So you'll see women literally working alongside men without any discrimination and so on. So that needs to happen. So inclusion is, like you've rightly pointed out, is the main thing that needs to happen in terms of digital development. And I'm not just talking about gender. That's one thing. Inclusion in terms of ethnicities, inclusion in terms of religion, inclusion in terms of all of other disparities that the societies have created, and not just in Pakistan but across the world. And that needs to be taken care of. Similarly, for instance, we did this research a while ago, and we found out, and these are rooted in some really menial issues, or some really sort of grassroots problems. I'll give you an example. We did this research called She Connects, right? So it was basically women who works in digital spaces and who also owns business in digital spaces, and what are their challenges. And we found out about 80% of them said that they have a challenge of transport. So again, it's a very grassroots, basic, fundamental problem. We are not talking about rocket science here, but all of these women who are working in technology, they are saying the biggest thing that is hampering their access to technology and to their job spaces and so on is transport. So you see, we need to come back to the drawing board, and we need to see and identify these fundamental issues which are creating havoc for us when it comes to inclusion, number one. Number two, the basic problems need to be solved first. And the basic problems are very simple two problems that you've identified yourself, access and inclusion. I feel once we do that, there will be a lot more opportunities for us to grow in terms of digital.
You talk about a certain methodology that needs to be put forward, a certain direction we need to take and how we need to move forward. But we need to have short-term and long-term goals as well, as far as our digital growth is concerned. What should be the short-term and what should be the long-term goals?
Look, this is very interesting. First off, we should start by this idea of investing into longer-term projects. Unfortunately, I've seen, and not to criticize anyone, but I've seen that generally people who are in the administration and in power, they feel that they would be better off investing into short-term projects, something that they can actually show off. And by show off, I don't mean to criticize them, but just to say that something that they can actually show for their work, that we have done this. Because if you invest in infrastructure, if you invest in, let's say, making internet more accessible, that's not something perhaps you can show in terms of big numbers and so on. But you can show how many people you have given laptops to, right?
True.
So one, this idea of investing into short-term projects needs to be done away with. We need to understand that the infrastructural development, specifically when it comes to technology, it's extremely important in the country. Number one. Number two, we need to make decisions with regards to these things which we call resource black holes. So for instance, educating people generally in terms of awareness is something that we in the development circle call education, resource black holes, because there's so much resource that is required in that way, and you keep putting in resource and you don't really see anything on the ground. That needs to happen, unfortunately. For instance, a great opportunity could have been educating people in terms of political disinformation before the election. ECP could have done a great job if they had invested a little bit of a money in terms of designing campaigns on it. They didn't do it. I think it was an opportunity lost, but obviously there are other opportunities in the future as well. Number two. Number three, we need to make sure that the technology and the exports and everything that we want, it's not going to come out of thin air. It's going to come out of the people of Pakistan, the populace, the stakeholders. They need to be developed. We need to understand the challenges of each of the stakeholder groups, right? You talk about freelancers, they'll give you a list of challenges that they have right now, all the way from internet access to the point how the dollar has affected their, the rates and the works and so on and so forth. You talk to technology service providers, they'll give you a list of challenges, how they're operating and whatnot and so on. So all of these challenges need to be addressed, because in the end, all of these stakeholders, they need to come together for the development to happen.
I think that is very important. All stakeholders need to be together and need to form a certain unanimous policy as far as moving together for Pakistan's digital growth. Thank you so very much, Asad Baig, to have joined us, head of MMDS, and of course doing such a lot of good research as far as taking Pakistan forward is concerned. Thank you so very much to have joined us. Let's come to our second story, and that concerns the information disorders that are present in Pakistan's society. Now, to discuss that, we've been joined by Professor James Kelly. He is the head of the journalism in the Indiana University in the United States of America. Professor Dr. James Kelly, are you with us?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Professor James Kelly, you are the Director of Journalism for the Indiana University Media School, and you've previously served as the first Director of the Undergraduate Studies for this media school as well. Your research includes influence of digital imaging technology on news photo credibility, audience understanding of photojournalism ethics, and photojournalism, digital image technology, and a lot more. I've seen the number of articles that you've published. I've seen the work that you've done over the years. How do you see the influence of digital imaging technology on news photo credibility and audience understanding of photojournalism ethics? Because we see a lot of photojournalism being used on the social media, on different forms of media as well, and sometimes the journalists behind it do not know what ethics are all about when it comes to photojournalism. What's your take on that?
Well, of course, photojournalism is but a small segment of photography generally. Since the invention of photography almost 200 years ago, the believability, the high verisimilitude of a photograph and actual experience was enough to cause it to be believed. The rendition was so close to the way we actually would have seen it had we been there, we just assumed a photograph was telling the truth. Photojournalists always have gone a step further than that, assuring their readers that they're acting ethically, not deceiving them in any way. Old forms of deception would be maybe from a different angle or a perspective that was misleading. The range of manipulations that could be made was fairly small, even if the manipulations were made in a chemical darkroom. With the advent of digital imaging, photographs became much more malleable. They could be adjusted and turned from, say, a dark photo to a light photo, or any number of other manipulations. Elements could be added from other photographs in a way that was apparently seamless. And so two people who had never been in the same room could be placed in the same room using digital technology, especially using Photoshop. This presents a dilemma for photojournalists. They desire to use the inherent believability of a photograph, but now photographs are being called into question. One of my earliest studies in 1990, I digitally manipulated 3 photographs and presented the same photograph unmanipulated. There were minor manipulations, but they were obvious. I then measured the believability that people would ascribe to these 2 forms of the photo, and I found something interesting. Everyone pretty much said that all 6 versions of the photos were believable. But when I placed the photos in various types of media context, say, for instance, some were in the Washington Post or appeared to be, and others appeared to be in the National Enquirer, a disreputable tabloid in the United States. What I found was that the same photo in the New York Times was more believable than the exact same photo in the National Enquirer, which was considerably less believable. I think this early experiment provides insight into how people are understanding photographs today. The ubiquity with which photographs are had. Anyone can make a photograph on their phone today, and it has many of those believable characteristics that the original photographs on tin and glass had. But the believability of an image is ultimately in context with the platform in which it's produced. A photo in the New York Times today is still, I dare say, more credible than a photograph just randomly seen on a Facebook post or an Instagram feed. The reason for this is because of the photojournalists who make those photos. We know that the photojournalists at the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Daily Jang, and Dawn are more believable because they come from journalists who are acting ethically, who have pledged to the audience that
therein is a small, not a dilemma, I would say, but a little context to it. How important becomes the role of mass media in society due to this use of social media platforms and the very easy access to information, whether it be through the New York Times that I myself am subscribed to, or the Washington Post, or Dawn that we have easy access to in Pakistan, and so many other newspaper, and publications that were previously only available through a certain format, but now are easily accessible digitally as well. Does that place a certain onus of responsibility on these organizations, and do they apply the rules and regulations as far as digital accuracy is concerned? Let's put it that way.
I believe that the digital accuracy, the believability, and the credibility of photographs that are published by reputable news organizations are as reliable, accurate, and truthful as they have always been, because those journalists remain ethically tied to truth-telling. Where the point of confusion comes is that these newspapers and television stations that were previously available only on paper or on a television set are now easily accessible on the same phone that is awash with images from unreliable sources, whether that's individuals posting to their Instagram, whether that's nefarious characters creating websites and feeds that are fictitious and dressed up to look like news sites. They are trying to steal the credibility of the historically and traditionally known mass media. And they've created a remarkable amount of confusion in the marketplace. The photographs that they produce are subject to manipulation, same as any photograph. But the credibility for the photograph, the believability of the photograph, really rests in the organization that's sponsoring it. When it's being sponsored by Instagram, we know that that photograph is no more believable than, well, the person who posted it. If that's our auntie, then we're probably going to believe it. But if it's somebody we don't know, we may not trust that photograph at all. I think young people are especially turning towards a point where they're no more trustworthy. They no longer find photographs completely trustworthy. When they look at a photograph, they wonder and maybe even assume that it's manipulated and digitally, that it's a digital lie.
All right. Thank you so very much to have joined us, Professor Dr. James Kelly. We're a bit short of time, or else we would have talked to you for a bit longer. But it was wonderful to have you on board to talk about social media and how different little things like pictures or even certain texts can change or alter people's attitudes as far as different realities across the world are concerned. Let's come to our last two stories very quickly. The first concerns the World Malaria Day. Of course, today it is being observed across the world and in Pakistan as well. The theme of the World Malaria Day 2024 is advancing health equity, gender equality, and human rights, which is undertaking to involve multiple stakeholders, which includes policymakers, which includes donors, healthcare providers, community members from all walks of life in the fight against malaria. Now, our Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif Sahab also has taken out a very important and long message on this occasion. He says we need to learn from each other's experiences and support each other's efforts in combating the disease, and we need to flag scientific researches to both experts and the general public and international partners, companies and foundations to showcase their efforts and reflect on how to further scale up malaria control interventions. The Ministry of National Health Services and Coordination through Common Management Unit Malaria, national and international partners, provincial counterparts, NGOs, private stakeholders have also significantly enhanced the free malaria testing and treatment facilities in the malaria endemic districts across the country. I think that is very important, because in this day and age, when we know that this is the time when malaria becomes rampant, and also a bit later in the year, we need to be careful and we need to work together in order to get as less cases of malaria as possible. Finally, let's come to Venice, where this city has become the first in the entire world on Thursday, that is today, to introduce a payment system for tourists in an effort to thin the crowd to throng the canals during the peak seasons. We know that the seasons are starting from May, and of course it will go on till September. Hundreds of thousands of people come, and Venice is small, and the canals are small as well, so overcrowding becomes a huge issue for at least the locals who are living there. April 25 is a national holiday in Italy. This is the first of 29 days this year when people must buy a ticket if they want to access the lagoon city from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Day trippers will be charged €5, about $5.35 outside the train station and near an empty footbridge, telling visitors they have to pay before diving into Venice's narrow alleyways. Let's see whether things like these are implementable in the long run as well. But of course, I think it's an important measure. With that, we come to an end of today's newsroom. We'll see you inshallah tomorrow with news story segments that pertain to us here in Pakistan. Stay safe. Allah Hafiz.